Well, listen, it is that time again. Listen, we are here in the space and place, listen, that we call Roughing It. That's right, the place where relationships are empowered, relationships are maximized, relationships are transformed. Because we don't come here for entertainment, we come here to learn. We come here to see how we can examine what's happening and be able to have something different. And so listen, I am glad to be here with you today. Listen, this is pastor and therapist, listen, Marcus Ruffin. And listen, I have something in store for you today. I'm excited about what it is that we're going to be discussing. Listen, I'm thrilled about where it is that we are going today. And so listen, I just want to make sure that, listen, you're ready. You know how you get ready, listen, for such a time as this. You know how you can say, listen, Roughing It is going to make a difference. Listen, here's how we do it. As you see here on the screen, listen, there are different ways in which, if you're on the YouTube, listen, if you're on YouTube, I need for you to be able to recognize that, listen, we want you to subscribe to our channel. Listen, we want you to hit those bell icons, that bell icon there on YouTube. Listen, if you're with us here on Facebook, I want to make sure that you are liking our page. I want to make sure that, listen, that you also hit that bell icon. And then I want to make sure, listen, that you like, you share, and you follow. Because we understand that, listen, when we do these things, we are changing not just our relationship, but we're changing the relationships of those that are around us, those that are in our circle, those, listen, that have significance and meaning in our lives. And so, listen, this is why we want to make sure that we are gathering here today for Roughing It. And because we're gathering here today, listen, for Roughing It, listen, we know that we do not come into this space and place in relationship by ourselves. Listen, we come into this space and place in relationship with others. And that's the reason why it's important that we bring those, listen, here to this space and place, because if we change and they don't change, listen, it's going to be a little more challenging for us to have the kind of results that we're looking for in our relationships. But listen, I am here, and therefore I'm hoping that you're here and those that are with you, listen, that they are ready for such a time as this. And listen, we want to go ahead and begin to delve into where we are going today. Listen, we want to delve into that right now. And so, listen, we want to thank you. And listen, we want to, listen, just appreciate the fact that you are here for such a time as this. And so, listen, let us go ahead and begin with our segment for today. And listen, if you are here for the first time, listen, we want to thank you for being here. But listen, if this is a time in which you're returning, then hopefully you've been here for these other segments that we've been talking about under this guise of, listen, relationship baggage. That's right. We've been talking about relationship baggage. And I hope that, listen, if you have not been here for this for such a time as now, I hope that, listen, that you would go back and watch the prior segments of where we have been talking about relationship baggage. I hope that you would go back and watch those, because I believe that we've been building and building and building on top of each other. And so we want to make sure that we are ready, listen, that we're ready for where it is that we're going today. And so, listen, I want you to notice this quote that is right here. Notice this quote that is right here. And I'm going to bring this up on the full screen so that you can see it. Notice now, it says this: our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. That's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people. Now, I think that is so power-packed. Listen, I think it's worth saying again. Our brains are wired, notice now, for connection, but trauma rewires our brain. Trauma rewires our brain, and that's for rewires them for protection. That's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people. And so, therefore, this is why when you and I see this particular quote here, I want you to understand that where we are going today and what we're going to be talking about today, listen, has some real significance, because when you and I are talking about healthy relationships and we're talking about wounds that happen in our lives and in our relationships, it helps us to begin to understand why some of the things, listen, that we are unpacking today, some of the things that we will be going over today are things that are really essential, because some of the issues that we might be having in our current relationship could very well be because of the wounds that are there in our lives. Listen, because of the wounds that are there in our lives. And so, listen, I hope that you're ready to really dive into this, because notice now, I want to always bring up a scripture passage, because when we talk about relationships here on this platform, listen, we're looking at it from both a spiritual, soulish, and physical position. Spiritual, soulish, and physical position. And so here, when you look at this particular passage, I want you to see here that this passage, it says here from Psalm 109, and I'm reading from the Amplified Bible. It says here, Psalms 109, verse 21. It says, "But you, O God, the Lord, show kindness to me for your name's sake, because your loving kindness, faithfulness, compassion is good. Oh, rescue me." So notice now, then it goes on to say this when we look here at verse 22. "For I am suffering, am needy, and my heart is wounded within me." So notice now, notice what he says now in this second part. I think it's important that we highlight this. He says, here's what's going on. Now, this is David that has written this. Notice now, he says that my heart is wounded within me. He says that my heart is wounded within me. Now, when we understand that he's saying here that his heart is wounded, now remember the quote that we just read. Matter of fact, I want to bring that quote back up just so that you can see it again. Notice now, the quote says this. It says, "Our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. That's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people." And so notice now, here we've read that quote. Here we're looking at this particular passage. And David, notice this is what David says. Now, the guy who made that statement, Ryan North, listen, he is an expert when it comes to childhood trauma. And so he has done studies, he's done research, he's done trainings, he has written curriculum, and he's talking about just how significant trauma affects our brain. Now, you have to remember, we're spirit, soul, and body. The body side has a brain. And he talks about just how much trauma affects the brain. And so not only does it affect the brain in terms of how it functions and operates, but depending upon when this happens, listen, it can affect brain development. And so therefore, trauma has significant impacts on anybody that has had trauma on any level. And obviously, the greater the level, the more significant impact that we are considering. So here when we read now in the scripture where it says, written by David, that says, listen, that there's trauma in my life. He says, I'm wounded. Now, if you go back and read the verses before we get to here in verse 20, you see that when David is talking about this wound, you see that he's talking in ways that does not sound familiar to the David that we know. And now when we get here to this particular portion, we understand why. Because David is dealing with woundedness. David is suffering on the inside. And David is recognizing that, listen, all these things that I said in the verses before I got to this one was nothing more than my pain that was leaking out. My heart was bleeding, and therefore I'm saying the things that I'm saying, not because they're coming from any other place than the fact that I am dealing with a wound. I wonder how many people that are watching this now, or how many people are watching this on the rerun or on the rebroadcast, and therefore you can identify with David. You can understand what Ryan North, the one who made the quote, stated, because you yourself is dealing with a wound. Or maybe you know somebody that is in relationship to you that this speaks so loudly about where they are and who they are, and therefore you know the wound that even they are addressing or not addressing, and how it's just leaking out of their life. And so therefore, as we understand here that whether you're talking about the quote that Ryan North stated, or you're talking about the scripture here, we understand that when David says that he has a wound, that we can even look over David's life and think about maybe the wound that he's referencing. I mean, if you know anything about David, I mean, maybe David was talking about the unforbidden sexual relationship that he had with Bathsheba. Maybe he was talking about even how he had Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed, because he had this relationship with Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. Maybe he was talking about maybe even how he was being falsely accused by his former boss, King Saul. And he was dealing with how he was running and on the run often from King Saul, because King Saul had this jealousy towards him. I mean, whether we look at those things or whether we talk about the turmoil that was going on in David's personal household with him and his children, we understand that when David says that he was wounded, that David could be referencing a slew of things. He may even be talking about a combination of all of it. But the point that we're trying to highlight is that whether you look at the quote by Ryan North or you look at the passage here, that wounds are a part of us living this life. Let me say that again. Wounds are a part of us living this life. And because wounds are a part of us living this life, it's important, listen, that you and I begin to understand that we have to unpack them. And so here, when we're looking here at this next slide, and it says this, relationship baggage, why baggage matters. I think if we have not understood this by now, listen, there's only a little bit more I can say. And that's the reality, is that as long as you and I have lived this life on earth, you and I have lived this life in relationship to somebody. And because we've lived this life in relationship to somebody, therefore, somewhere along the way, there has been some wound that has been felt. There's been some wound that has been experienced, whether we have been on the receiving end or we have been on the giving end. The reality is that all of us, having lived this life, having reached adulthood, if you are an adult, by the time that you're listening to this, then you recognize that, listen, we have not been living in a bubble. Listen, this teaching is happening on the tail end of the pandemic, and so we may have felt like we've been living in a bubble, but the reality is that we have not lived in a bubble all of our life. And so therefore, listen, emotional baggage can get heavy, just like physical baggage can be heavy. Emotional baggage can be heavy. And when you and I are carrying it alone, listen, you and I, listen, can begin to have all types of issues because, listen, you've got to unpack that baggage. You were not designed, you and I were not built to be able to carry this baggage and to carry this for a long period of time. And that's the reason why when we understand the research and we understand the trauma and we understand the different things that have occurred, we understand why, listen, we understand why we've got to unpack it. And so therefore, listen, unpacking our, unpacking our baggage, unpacking our relationship baggage becomes really important because, listen, it is unpacking. Notice when we bring up this slide. What's relationship baggage? Now, we have answered that question over this time, but listen, I want to make sure that, listen, we are unpacking that just once again today. Relationship baggage, listen, is difficult and painful things that we've been through in past relationships that tend to follow us in future relationships. Let me say that again. They're the difficult and painful things that we've gone through in past relationships that tend to follow us into future relationships. It's almost like it's a collection of artifacts from past experiences that now become packaged in these new opportunities, in these new exchanges. And therefore, this is why any overfilled suitcase, any overfilled baggage, emotional baggage, will begin to weigh you and I down. And although most of us will tend to pivot with the typical answer, oh, just let it go. Oh, that's in the past. Just get over it. The reality is, if it was just that easy to unpack it, then we would have unpacked it a long time ago, and we would have found ourselves moving in the forward direction. But the reality is that it's usually not that easy, and even as we learned today, sometimes it's not even that obvious. And so, listen, let us begin to look at this next slide. And so notice now, here it says, actually, last time, or the first time when we had this particular, when we started down this path, listen, we began to talk about a few things. One of the things that we talked about was core beliefs. And listen, and when you're unpacking baggage, one of the things that you have to look at, listen, is core beliefs. Because listen, it is sometimes the things that we believe at a core level that sometimes helps keep those suitcases closed, helps keeps those things even fills those suitcases even more. We really unpack that. And so if you miss any of that, you can definitely go back and watch that. Listen, here is the second one where we talked about identifying relationship patterns. We begin to understand that when we talk about our bonds and we talk about our attachments with people, that therefore these are the kind of things that begin to become baggage, other baggage that we begin to carry on in our relationships. And so therefore it doesn't matter who it is, that when you and I begin to understand how these things show up, doesn't matter if it's a boss, doesn't matter if it's a spouse, doesn't matter if it's a child, before you know it, listen, we begin to have those same experiences across the board. And so we change sometimes girlfriends and boyfriends out only to deal with the same stuff because they're relationship patterns. And then I think that we talked here about complacency. And we talked about these different relationship stages. And because we have these particular relationship stages as it relates to us unpacking our baggage, we've got to be able to recognize that some things are revealed, some things are unraveled, some things unfold as the relationship progresses. Sometimes there are things that we don't even know about ourselves until we hit certain milestones and we hit certain ages. And sometimes it's only when we've grown up or we have matured that we're even able to handle sometimes the reality of these dynamics about ourselves. Sometimes we can't handle the dynamics about others as it relates to the relationship because we're not at a place really be able to digest that information and those truths and those principles. And so we really unpack that. And so today, I want us to unpack this last one. And let me just say that, listen, we're going to be taking the next month off. And so we won't do it here for the month of June. So this would be our last one for this month, the month of May. And so here we want to unpack this as it relates to relationship wounds. We want to unpack this as it relates to relationship wounds. Now, I use the word wounds, and sometimes you'll hear the word being used in certain conversations. And so I like to use that as I compare it to physical wounds or psychological. See, physical wounds are very similar to psychological wounds in the sense that they come in different sizes, and therefore there are different levels of treatment. You know that, listen, if there's certain physical wounds that you have, you may have to go to emergency services. Or you may have to have a surgery because the wound just cuts that deep. But then there are some physical wounds that, listen, may require hospitalization. But then there are some other wounds that, listen, it may just require outpatient care. And because it only requires outpatient care, therefore, it's not that it's not serious, but the level of treatment that's needed is on a smaller scale than what would be required in an emergency or a surgery. And so, therefore, when it comes to psychological wounds or it comes to emotional wounds, that it also seems to carry that similarity. And so therefore, I want you to see this next slide that I'm bringing up on the screen. And notice now, one of the things that baggage helps us to identify with these relationship wounds is that relationship wounds often equal emotional baggage, and emotional baggage often equals trauma. Let me say that again. When you have wounds, what we're referencing is that there's emotional baggage. And when we have emotional baggage, we're also saying that, listen, there's been some trauma along the way. Now, you may not be used to hearing that word trauma, but trauma is nothing more than like a physical wound. It is where you've been cut. It's where you've been significantly impacted emotionally. So much so that, listen, for some people, it will literally cause them to have a diagnosis of what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so sometimes you find people that have been really traumatized in events like wars, or maybe somebody was raped, or maybe somebody was in, like, let's say, some kind of abusive relationship, so like domestic violence. Those are the types of examples where somebody that may classify for the diagnosis of PTSD. But not everything necessarily rises to the level of a PTSD diagnosis. There are things that, listen, also where there's trauma in our lives, that, listen, it may not rise to that level, but it doesn't mean that it's not significant and it's not important. Remember, like a physical wound, you have emergency services, you have ER, you have emergency surgeries or surgeries in general, all the way down to outpatient care. And so when we talk about emotional baggage, or we're talking about trauma, or we're talking about wounds, we're talking about where there is usually something that has happened in the past that we would consider to be traumatic. Sometimes it's what we call those deep, shameful secrets. That we don't feel really comfortable in sharing. We don't feel very comfortable in talking with others about. We don't really kind of open up to anybody and everybody about those particular things. It's those shameful secrets. Sometimes it falls up under the category of past relationship pain. You know, when you were in relationship with the family member, the aunt, the uncle, the mother, or the dad, you know, and some things occurred that didn't just hurt your feelings, but it cut a little deeper, and it actually left a scar of some sort. Listen, it could be childhood experiences, where you were in school and maybe there was the school bully, or maybe there were a group of kids that used to just kind of pick on you and just call you out and just kind of make you feel bad, created some kind of shame. And so trauma can show up in a variety of ways. And so it can show up in friendships. It can show up in serious relationships. It can show up in romantic relationships. There are times in which we've dated somebody, maybe we were even engaged, and it created the kind of experience that says, I don't want to do this again. I don't want to let somebody that close to me again. I don't want to be that vulnerable. I don't want to fill in the blank. And so therefore, there was some kind of trauma that we experienced. And so whether it's low scale or medium scale or high scale, the reality is that there was some trauma. And sometimes because we haven't understood this, nobody's really talked to us about it, there's not really been any education surrounding it, sometimes we don't know that this classifies as trauma. And because, listen, this is classified as trauma, it will impact the way that you think. It will impact the way that you interact with others. Listen, this is the kind of stuff that can weigh us down. And listen, remember what the quote says. Listen, I got to go back to that quote. I think that quote is so powerful. Listen, we've got to read it again. Our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. That's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people. This is why when you and I don't recognize the wound, when you and I don't recognize the trauma, listen, when you and I don't recognize the emotional baggage, it begins to make the pain, the suffering, the problem to last longer. How many of you know that, listen, if you don't go and get certain wounds treated, as minor as they may be, if they get infected, listen, that thing can go from just something small to something that turns into a crisis. It turns into an emergency simply because we didn't deal with it at its lower stage. Sometimes this is what happens with trauma is that, listen, we've been in some situations that have had a traumatic effect on us. We didn't know that it was traumatic. We didn't deal with it. We just tried to, sweep it under the rug. And before you know it, we're in another relationship and something else happens. And before you know it, it impacts or compounds that original trauma. It adds to it. And before you know it, we got a snowball effect going on. And we don't even recognize what's happening until sometimes we're at an emergency, we're at a crisis, we're totally out of hand, we're totally acting out, we're totally like just losing it. And we're trying to figure out at that moment, what's happening with me? And the reality is, I've been traumatized. And I hope that, listen, maybe by what we're talking about today, maybe by what we covered today, it has given a little light, maybe a little flashlight, maybe just a sense of, I think maybe there's something under that rock over there. There's something behind that behavior. There's something behind my emotional responses or reactions. And so therefore, this is why I want you to understand that when we talk about wounds, when we talk about emotional baggage, when we're referencing relationship baggage, we're talking about usually some trauma that is a part of the equation in that regard. And so here, I want you to see this next slide. Listen, when we talk about relationship wounds, we're talking also about recognizing that they are triggers. Listen, when we're talking about wounds, when we're talking about emotional baggage, we're talking about trauma, it is recognizing that they're triggers. And what is a trigger? A trigger is typically a word that we use when someone has a sensitive area that tends to be a trigger or a reactive response. Let me say that again. A trigger is a word that we typically use to describe a sensitive area that tends to trigger a reactive response. It tends to have this sort of reaction that is not conducive to the situation at hand. You know, if I was to cut my finger, and granted, I'm healthy, there's no other, issue that is going on, and I cut my finger, paper clip, let's say, my response may be ouch, but if I'm wailing and screaming and acting like I'm having a heart attack, we would say, what in the world is going on with that person? It was just a paper clip. Well, sometimes it's that same way when we talk about triggers that happen in relationships, that somebody will say or do something that your reaction is totally above board, but for you it seems normal. For you it seems rational. For you it seems like the right thing to do. But for others that are looking in, others that may even be experiencing this with you, will kind of look at you a little side eye because they think, well, something is wrong here, because the reaction is not equated with the scenario that happened. Let me give you an example. Let's say that your family interrupted you a lot and you didn't feel like you could get a word in edgewise growing up. Now you are adult. You've experienced that for several years, several times over and over. And now you find yourself in adult relationships. And the moment, listen, somebody interrupts you, it triggers this reactive, angry response that is not necessarily or proportional to the situation at hand. And the person, as much as they may understand it, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have interrupted you, but the way that you reacted to it was totally uncalled for. And so therefore, when you and I are talking about relationship wounds, it is being able to recognize that over time, some traumatic event left a scar, left a wound, left some kind of damage with you and I. And so therefore, over time, we begin to develop these habits, listen, that we may or may not recognize. I'm overreacting. I feel like, hey, you've crossed the line and I'm going to let you have it. And so therefore, listen, it begins to become a way that now I just react without even thinking about it. I don't even think twice about it because it has become such a protective mechanism. It has become such a way in which I just go about acting that I don't even recognize how off-centered I am. It's because there was a trigger, but the trigger was connected to a wound. It was connected to some emotional baggage. It was connected to a trauma. And so therefore, when you and I understand that, here's some typical areas in which that may happen. Listen, it can show up in how you and I show affection or don't show affection. It can show up in how we handle conflict. It can show up in how we feel about sex or sexuality. It can show up in how you and I handle money. This is why, listen, not everything is related to just budgeting. Some of this emotional spending that we're doing is simply because, listen, it's simply because it's a mechanism that we use to try to bring us some kind of self-soothing, some kind of feel-good component because something else is out of sync. Now, I understand that there are times in which it can be used, shopping, right, can be used as a reward. But then there are some times in which this whole spending mechanism is nothing more than just an indication of me trying to find help and healing for an area where I've been traumatized. And so listen, whether you talk about affection or conflict, listen, we could talk about intimacy and vulnerability. All of these can be areas in which I'm overly sensitive or I am just a little too sensitive. And it's simply because it is connected to some trauma, it's connected to a wound, and therefore it has triggered the kind of response that indicates that, listen, whether you're my best friend, whether you are my dating partner, listen, whether you're my spouse or you are a family member, or listen, it can be simply that we're just co-laborers at work. Listen, we're just neighbors in the neighborhood. But there are things in which that are said, things that are done that triggers this kind of reaction because it's connected to a wound. So the question here is this: how, listen, notice now, how to address relationship wounds. How to address relationship wounds. How to address relationship wounds. That is the question. And I want to give you two things today that I think that will help. So if we look here at this first one, it says managing my stressors. Managing my stressors. Now, the question here is managing my stressors as we're talking about relationship wounds. Here's the reason that I talk about this one first. Is because dealing with trauma, listen, often means looking not just at the root cause, but at how the symptoms are being expressed. How is my anger being expressed? How is my withdrawal being expressed? How is my anxiety being expressed? And how do I manage these things? Because the reality is, if this is a wound, if this is some traumatic area, I'm probably not going to get better overnight because I didn't get damaged overnight. Or may I say this, the damage may have happened overnight, but how I've learned to deal with that damage over time did not happen overnight. And so some of this I've got to unlearn, some of this I've got to relearn. And therefore, in order for me to even get to a place to where some learning can happen, I've got to be able to manage my stressors. See, sometimes, listen, when we're talking about managing my stressors, managing, listen, these things that have a tendency to just kind of tick me off, send me in the wrong direction, sometimes I've got to recognize that there are some things I've got to do because I can't control the scenario, I can't control the people, I can't control what's happening around me, but I can control what's happening in me. And so therefore, being able to recognize that sometimes I may need some emotional tools. Sometimes I may need some validation tools. See, a good example could be that maybe somebody's giving me constructive criticism. And as much as constructive criticism is just that, constructive, because of my past experience with not being validated, not being loved, not being embraced, not having words of affirmation, because of that experience, right, I'm a little more sensitive, maybe even highly sensitive, in an unhealthy way to constructive criticism, because I don't hear it from the constructiveness, I hear it from the destructiveness. And so therefore I may need to recognize that when I'm going to get some constructive criticism, maybe it's at work and my boss is going to go over my performance evaluation. Maybe it's through a group of friends and they're going to give me some feedback on maybe how I performed or how I did a certain thing. I may need to give myself some self-validation. I may need to tell myself some things before I hear from anybody else, because it's going to help me, notice now, to manage my stresses, because I recognize in these scenarios, in these situations, I am a little more hypersensitive. And because of that, therefore, I've got to protect myself. I've got to insulate myself, not so much that I can't hear what I need to hear or learn what I need to learn, but so that it does not begin to trigger me back into a space and place that doesn't fit this scenario. This time that I'm listening to my boss or coworkers or friends or maybe even family members, they're not trying to hurt me. They're not trying to bring me down. They're not trying to kill me internally. I may need to tell myself that before I ever hear from them, because I have such a sensitivity to this area that it's hard for me to hear constructive criticism. And so therefore, the more that I can understand and identify my triggers, the more, listen, I can turn to the people that are in the boat with me, the people who are there to support me. Now, this may not be a lot of people, and that's fine, but you need to know who they are. Or you need to build a group so that you can know who they are. But the more that you understand your triggers, the more that you can look to your support group. And you can begin to tell them, hey, listen, my stuff is coming up and I'm a little scared. I know we're getting ready to give me an evaluation, but you know what? I don't deal well in this regard. And they can be truthful, but understanding, and can be a lot more helpful because they understand what's happening with me. They understand where I'm coming from, and therefore they're not trying to milk the truth or water down the truth, but they are trying to package it in such a way that I can digest it. Listen, it gives you the ability to be able to say, you know, when I hear X, Y, or Z, it brings it all up to me. And the more that you can turn to your support and you can say it, the more opportunities your support, listen, has to understand you and to be able to support you. Here's the next thing I would like to point out when we talk about what are some things that we can do to address our wounds, our relationship wounds. And so here, when you look here on the screen, it says processing my emotions. Processing my emotions. Now, I would have to tell you that when it comes to processing emotions, listen, we understand that trauma will trigger intense responses. Now, let's just get that clear. Trauma will, listen, it will trigger intense responses. Whether they come out, whether you say it, whether it is obvious, doesn't mean that, listen, there isn't some type of internal volcano. There isn't some type of internal eruption. It doesn't mean that, listen, there isn't something internal that is going on. Even if nobody else knows it, the reality is that it's there. And so you've got to accept and you've got to understand and recognize that trauma is known for triggering intense responses. Listen, especially by those who are close to us. So that tells me that when I talked about managing my stressors, I may have to recognize that those that are close to me, in these moments where I know that I've been a little more traumatic, I've been a little more traumatized, then I'm going to have some kind of way to process my emotions, because I know what happens in close relationships. Listen, you may know that you have certain issues and want to get them handled, but the process is often layered, and therefore it is an unraveling of the baggage. You know how when you pack things and you're trying to pack as much in that suitcase as you can, and there are certain things that you put on the bottom versus certain things that you put on the top. I've seen my wife that even knows how to try to pack things so that, you know, your shirts get as less wrinkled as possible. It's a whole systematic process to packing so that you can get the most out of it. Well, it's the same way here when we talk about the unpacking. It is being able to recognize that some of it is layered. And so as you are unraveling, listen, it may be a 5-layer to it, and you may just get to 1 and 2 until sometimes you're ready to process it. You're able to handle it. You're able to digest it. Listen, sometimes just being able to kind of regurgitate those experiences and go there is sometimes a process in and of itself. And so therefore, it is just processing even what you know. We haven't even, I mean, let's not even mention, or may I say, let's mention the part where maybe you don't know. And somebody else is seeing it, somebody else is bringing it to your attention, and you've been in denial, you've been saying that's not true. And the reality is that there is some trauma there. And you haven't just been at a place that where you could hear it for what it is worth. And so therefore, processing your emotions also means that I have to have some awareness with it. And so I've got to be able to understand that part of this awareness, right, has to be I'm confronting things, because sometimes we see it and we don't want to confront it. Sometimes we know something is there, but we don't want to look any deeper. We don't really want to look further into it. But the reality is, if I am going to process my emotions, then I'm going to have to confront it to the point that, listen, I'm unraveling, I'm addressing it, listen, and at some point over the process of time, it gets to a place to where there's healing, and listen, I'm no longer triggered. Now, being triggered doesn't mean that I'm not sensitive, but it means that I'm not as reactive. And so I can recognize, hey, here's what's happening with me, but I now have enough understanding, I have enough consciousness and awareness to where I know how to manage, I know how to make choices, and I know how to unpack it. But the reality is that, listen, it sometimes takes the time to do that. Sometimes it takes a therapist to help us to unpack that. Sometimes it takes us being in a support group to unpack it. I remember when I was really dealing with some father issues that had happened in my childhood, and now I'm in college, and I was in a support group, and we were all talking about our father issues. And it really just unveiled some things. It really gave me some ahas. It gave me some spotlights. It really just gave me opportunities to really unpack all that was there. But remember, I told you I was in college. I'm in my 20s, and I'm dealing with some of these things at this age. Now, have I known that there were some things going on? Yes, but did I understand them to the level of their trauma? No. But I'm telling you that it was through the process of the support group. It was through the process of talking with a therapist that I was able to really get to a place that where I'm not triggered by things. Listen, I got to a place that, listen, am I still sensitive? Yes. But I'm much more aware and conscious and much more stronger and how I'm able to manage that. And so I'm telling you that, listen, if you and I are going to have relationships with those that are meaningful and significant, then what's going to be important is that we begin to unpack our wounds, because as I said, they show up in those in which we are most close to. And because it shows up in those relationships, some of us are dealing with unnecessary drama because it's all tied to our trauma. Now, I'm going to say that again. Some of us are dealing with unnecessary drama because it's tied to our trauma. And I'm saying to you that it is time for you and I to get healthier in our relationships by being able to deal with the trauma that has happened in other relationships. And so, listen, I just want you to know that, listen, this is why we're here. We're here to help you to maximize your relationships so that you might be able to have the kind of fulfillment, the kind of satisfaction, the kind of maximization that causes you to want to be with those that are in the circle, to live with those that are in the circle, to even bring those within your circle, because we understand that when we get better, relationships get better. when relationships get better, we get better. We feed the relationship and the relationship feeds us. And so the same way that, listen, we can be traumatized by a relationship, listen, we can be healed by a relationship. And so, listen, I want to thank you for being here today with Roughing It. I want to thank you for spending this time as we have talked about wounds, and we've talked about how we are to deal with the emotional baggage and how we are to deal with the trauma. And so, listen, here's one thing I would definitely like to ask you to do is that, listen, if you believe that this has been impactful, that this has helped move the needle, that this has been in some shape, form, or fashion, something that you believe was a good investment in your life, I'm asking that you would partner with us. I'm asking, listen, that not only would you partner with us, listen, I'm asking, listen, here's how you would partner with us. If you look here on the screen, listen, you can partner with us through Cash App by giving a financial donation here to LifeEmpowermentCh. That is the Cash App. If you look here, PayPal, LEC at let-god.org. If you would like to use a money order or to mail in a check, you can definitely do that by sending it to LifeEmpowermentCh, P.O. Box 7958, Moreno Valley, California 92552. And so we thank you, listen, for your partnership, whether it is through the Cash App. Listen, we thank you for your partnership, listen, whether it is through PayPal or listen, or whether it is through sending a check or a money order. But we just thank you for your partnership. Listen, we thank you for helping to make this possible because of your giving, because of your financial contribution. And so, listen, it has been a joy. Listen, it has been great. I pray that, listen, not only has it been great and good, but listen, that it has been transformational. And so this is Pastor and Therapist Marcus Ruffin with you again. And remember, listen, we won't be doing anything over the next month of June. So I look forward to seeing you again in July. And listen, at that time, we're going to pick up in a new subject area. And we're going to delve again into helping you to maximize your relationship so that, listen, they're the kind of relationships that you want to come home to, you want to join in with again, you want to hang out with them again, you want to see them again because they're just that fulfilling. All right, listen, God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next time. This is Roughing It.